Okay. The attendees are still joining, so I'm giving them 1 second. I see the numbers increasing. Okay. All right, I believe that is everyone. So we'll get started. Greetings, my name is Carrie McLean, and I'm a member of the steering committee that organized the International Commission of Inquiry on Systemic Racist Police Violence against People of African Descent in the United States. So, in way of background, I'll tell you a bit about how this commission came to be. In June 2020, an international coalition of hundreds of organizations and individuals sent a communication to the United Nations Human Rights Council urging that the UN convene a commission of inquiry to investigate racism and racist police violence in the United States. In an unprecedented move, the UN's African group, which comprises 54 countries from the African continent, supported the efforts of the activists and issues its own call for a commission of inquiry in a draft resolution. The US pushed back against the efforts, and the Human Rights Council declined the request. Following the UN's decision to not convene a commission of inquiry, the National Conference of Black Lawyers, the National Lawyers Guild, and the International Association of Democratic Lawyers decided to convene a commission of inquiry to conduct the thorough and impartial investigation of police violence in the United States that the community had demanded. The Commission of Inquiry's mandate was to investigate the systemic, widespread, and grave violations of the rights of Black people by police in the United States and present its findings and recommendations in a report. We assembled a team of 12 experts, commissioners, none of whom are from the United States, to conduct the investigations in an independent and impartial manner. We conducted live hearings where the commissioners heard testimony from the family members of victims of police violence, testimony from lawyers who represent the families of victims, and testimony from community activists. The commissioners also reviewed reports, legislation, and other relevant materials. After the hearings concluded, the commissioners made their findings and recommendations, and a team of rapporteurs compiled the information into a report. That report was released to the general public today. Today, our commissioners and one of our rapporteurs will present the findings and recommendations at this press conference. Before we move to that, we want to lift up the voices of a few family members whose loved ones were murdered by police. These are a few of the courageous, fierce people who gave testimony for the Commission of Inquiry. First is Colette Flanagan, founder of Mothers Against Police Brutality. Her son, Clinton Allen, was murdered by the police. Colette?
Thank you, Carrie. It's a pleasure to be here today with this esteemed panel in support of this Commission of Inquiry report highlighting systemic racist police violence against people of African descent in the United States. I started Mothers Against Police Brutality because the Dallas police killed my son, my only son, Clinton Allen, in 2013. Clinton was only 25 years old. He was an unarmed Black man, shot 7 times, 5 times in his chest, once in his upper left right arm, and 1 close range shot in his back. MAPB works from a unique perspective, from a perspective that gives us the lived experience through the lens of mothers and family members who have lost their children and loved ones to police violence in the United States. And when you work from this lived experience, from this lens of losing a child or a loved one to police violence, you have the opportunity to see and understand the impact and devastation that most never see. MAPB upholds the many, many victims that you've never heard of because their egregious deaths did not make the national news. As horrific and egregious the police killings that we are currently witnessing, even after George Floyd's horrific death, it's only a minuscule of actual police killings reported from the 18,000 police departments in the United States, because the US federal government does not track this data. In fact, there is a Derek Chauvin in every police department, and some have many, Derek Chauvin, as we know by the evidence of the continual killing of Black men and women at the hands of police, which is almost a daily occurrence. Last week, as we were awaiting the Chauvin verdict, just 30 minutes prior to the verdict, the Ohio police killed a 16-year-old Black girl, Ma'Khia Bryant. 16-year-old Ma'Khia was shot 4 times. And I think the question we should be asking ourselves, why would a policeman shoot a child 4 times? Or even if he thought she was an adult female, was that really necessary? Would that policeman have seen Ma'Khia as a threat if she looked like his sister or his aunt or his child or even his mother? Could he have shot someone 4 times that looked familiar to him? I think not. When did this officer no longer see Ma'Khia as a threat? Was it after the first shot, the second shot, the third shot, the fourth shot? But in this current US police culture that trains policemen to eliminate the threat and not to escalate, it's a deadly policy that is costing more and more Black lives daily. It doesn't matter if there are 100 policies to de-escalate. When you have a culture of systemic racism deeply seated and rooted in your police department, as in the United States, those policies just do not work. When police departments are still insisting that policemen, when caught on camera using unnecessary deadly force, are merely just a few bad apples, we are way past a few bad apples. We are into orchards of bad apples with trees that have disease roots tainted with racism and white supremacy, and they are bearing rotten fruit. This is why the work of this civil society-led initiative, organized by the National Conference of Black Lawyers, the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, and the National Lawyers Guild, is so important. And I want to thank the eminent jurist who heard testimonies from many family members of victims of police brutality, and including myself. Their report is an important contribution to recent efforts to hold the United States accountable and directly support the demand we made last summer jointly with the ACLU and other groups to the UN Human Rights Council to create an independent commission of inquiry to look into racist police killings in the United States. We hope that the UN High Commissioner's report, which is expected this June, will support our demand to create an effective accountability mechanism into law enforcement killings, especially of Black men and women. I strongly believe that a robust international accountability mechanism would further support and complement, not undermine, efforts to dismantle systemic racism in the United States, including by the Biden administration. In closing, I would strongly encourage every commissioner from every state, from every city, from every parish, from every hamlet, and from every jurisdiction to support this Commission of Inquiry report. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colette. Thank you. Next is Mr. Philonis Floyd, whose brother George was murdered by the police.
Hello, everyone. As you all know, my brother George Floyd was murdered by Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis on May 25th, 2020. And for the first time in recent American history, that an officer was charged for killing an unarmed Black man. And it was guilty, guilty, guilty. And, you know, people all around the world, they joined us and celebrated the victory, because it was a day that we thought was filled up like celebration. But for a moment, you know, we actually thought that Black lives had mattered. But it took time for us to reflect, and I just think about Dante Wright and how we had to plan and attend his funeral to be support for him and his family. Basically, it's getting to me now because I'm thinking about everything that's going on, but y'all know how I feel about everything. We have to continue to fight for systemic change. Basically, I just want to thank everybody from protesters, like the International Commission of Inquiry. I'm happy. I'm happy that you all just gave me the opportunity to be here and speak. And I'm not just speaking for George, I'm speaking for everybody around the world, because justice for George, to me, it means freedom for all. I want to talk about like different things like the violence in the United States and the commissioners from all around the globe, the world, who listen to what happened to my brother and listen to what happened to others all across this world, and who have taken action like to condemn human rights abuse and recommend like social change. Um, I want to thank the commissioners for recognizing my humanity as a good Black man in America, and for recognizing my brother George Floyd's humanity and the humanity of other families across this nation, and bringing the light and acknowledging the United States government is perpetrating crimes against humanity against Black people in the United States. Um, I want my brothers and sisters I want my brothers and sisters just all around this globe to be understanding and reminded that we are our brothers and sisters keepers, and that we, have great social responsibility, that we all have to work toward each other, and that our humanity bonds us beyond borders. I want to thank the commissioners from around the globe for accepting the the greatness of everybody around here, and accepting, like, convening the commission, and for acknowledging that the murder of my brother George Floyd is a part of a pattern that crimes against humanity being committed against Black people, against my people in America. Every day I think about people all around this world, and I think about how we live in fear of police officers. And I look and I think about how I spoke to many families and had to console them and comfort them and let them know that I hope everything is going to be okay, because I can't make it okay for them. But I try to give them the understanding of, I've been here before, and I know what I'm going through, and I know what you all going through. But the hardest part of all of it is trying to talk to a mother who lost their child, because I'm just a brother. And even though I have that love, but I don't have the love that a mother has, because a mother can heal a child without medicine, because they have a different love, they have a different bond. It's a unique bond. And I just want to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to be able to just submit a message to the world and get out, because this George Floyd Policing Act that we're pushing here in the United States, it's blood on that bill, and everybody from Ahmaud Arbery, Eric Garner, George Floyd, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, there's so many people who didn't even have footage that are on that bill. And I want to thank you all for giving me this opportunity and this blessing to open up and speak to you all, because every time you all drop one tear looking at George Floyd, I drop 2 to 3. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Philonis. Thank you. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much.
I, I think we have Gwen Carr on the phone. Gwen, if you're here, can you please unmute?
Okay.
Okay.
Hello?
Thank you. Yes, this is Gwen Carr, whose son, Eric Garner, was murdered by the police.
Mhm. Yes. As you all know, my son Eric Garner was murdered almost 7 years ago on the streets in New York. He said, "I can't breathe," 11 times, and the police officers, they decided to take his life anyway. And since that time, I've been out here, I've been advocating for justice, not only justice for my son, but justice for everyone's son, for the unborn, for my grands, for just all, I'm just so sympathetic in the Black and brown communities because this is where they come in, brutalize, terrorize, and they confront us for no apparent reason, and it all gets swept under the rug. And since my son's murder, I said, this is not going to happen no more, not on my watch, if there's anything that I can do about it. And so that's why I've been traveling around the nation and trying to advocate, speak, and step up where I can. Even as we speak, I'm in North Carolina trying to advocate for Andrew Brown, who was murdered, who was shot in the back of the head, who was execution style. And this just keeps happening. I was so elated about the George Floyd trial that the verdict came back positive on all 3 counts. And the same time that we were getting the verdict, our brothers were being murdered. Although we knew that there was a lot of work that we would have to do, even though we got a positive verdict for George Floyd. But we know that that was one verdict, but that verdict, it was a little bit of victory for us all. But we can't stop. And we can see that now because there's been 4 or 5 murders since the George Floyd verdict. And we don't know, but I feel, in my opinion, it's revenge because of the verdict. And we just cannot have officers going around taking our lives at will. This does not happen in the white communities. In the white communities, you never hear of Black police officers shooting down white children or white people. So why do they do that to us? And that's why we have to get bills passed, which I have gotten several bills passed in the past. The Eric Garner anti-chokehold bill. I've got the 50A law passed and the Safer New York Act passed. But there's no good in passing laws if they're not enforced. And with the 50A, they tried to overturn it. That's why you can't rest. Just because there's a bill passed, that don't mean that it's going to be written in stone. That the police, they will try to overturn it. So you got to be very watchful. And we can't all watch by ourselves. We need the whole all the communities to watch. We need all the communities to come together. And with that said, it's just not enough being done, I don't think, because when we take one step forward, look like they push us 2 steps back. And I just want to hear one time that everybody is on one accord, which we know that's going to take a lot to do that. So, but I am so glad to be on this panel so we can hear the different opinions and the different triumphs of different families and different community leaders. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Carr. And just really, Colette, Philonis, Ms. Carr, we really appreciate you being here today. It's an honor for us. Okay, so I'm going to move quickly to the next person, which is Professor Lennox Hines, the coordinator of the project, who's also going to offer some remarks about the project.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On behalf of the steering committee of this international commission, we'd like to thank and extend our condolences to the families and victims who had to relive the pain and horrors of the senseless, unjustified, and illegal executions of their loved ones. In particular, we'd like to extend our condolences to Colette Flanagan, who we heard this morning, Philanese Floyd, and Gwen Carr. Their loved ones and the loved ones of all of the victims that we have heard testimonies of, they fell at the hands of the police here in the United States. The same police who are sworn to serve and protect, and instead served as executioners of our children and of our loved ones, and who were, in all instances, the victims were unarmed or posing no threat or serious bodily harm to the police or to any third persons. And in the words of one of the family members whose testimony we heard, the only weapon that they had was the color of their skin. We also extend our thanks and appreciation to the 12 commissioners, some of whom are on this panel today, representing international experts from Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. We thank them for taking time from their busy professional activities to dedicate time to reviewing witness statements, presiding over hearings, and listening to the heart-wrenching testimonies of the victims' families, and then preparing their findings and recommendations. We thank our 4 rapporteurs who helped in the coordination of the testimony of the witnesses during the hearings and introduced the witnesses to the commissioners and assisted the commissioners in preparing their report. We thank our outreach staff who reviewed hundreds of cases of the unjustified killings of Black men and women in the United States. And because of constraints of time, we were only able to select 44 cases of the most egregious cases for our hearings. These cases represent only the tip of the iceberg of the systemic nature of the pandemic of racist police violence against people of African descent in the United States. These cases were gathered from all around the United States, from the Northeast, from the Southeast, from the Northwest, Southwest, Central states, 20 states in all, and 33 cities across the United States. And the cases spanned 20 years, as we heard. The cities were large, the cities were small. We heard testimony of the variety of methods used by the police in their killings. All of these killings were malicious and intentional of unarmed Black men, Black women, and trans and gender non-conforming Black people across the United States. The victims were shot. They were tortured with tasers inflicting 50,000 volts of electricity into the bodies of people suffering from mental illness. Some of the witnesses were suffocated. Some were choked to death. Others were killed when the police used their very vehicles as weapons of lethal weapons. In all cases, the victims were unarmed. I would be amiss if I did not thank my fellow members of the steering committee who spent the last 10 months working and preparing the report that you will be hearing today. The international delegation of jurists, the genesis, rather, of this International Commission of Inquiry was inspired by the petition of Paul Robeson and William Patterson, who in 1951 filed a petition at the United Nations entitled "We Charge Genocide in the Crimes of the US Government Against the Negro People." The predecessor to this International Commission today was a commission that was a petition that was filed in 1978 by the National Conference of Black Lawyers, the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, and the United Church of Christ. And they filed that petition on Human Rights Day in December 1978. In support of that petition, they assembled the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, assembled a international delegation of jurists from Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean to travel to the United States, visit prisons across the United States, talk to prisoners in these various states, and prepare their report. Today, the findings and recommendations of our International Commission of Inquiry into Systemic Racist Police Violence Against People of African Descent filed our report with the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights on March 30th of 2021, just a few weeks ago. Some of the key findings of fact and recommendations contained in the report will be presented to you by representative commissioners and one of our rapporteurs. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Lennox, thank you very much. And with that, we'll move into the findings. Max Bokwana, Commissioner Max Bokwana from South Africa, is the president of the Southern African Development Community Lawyers Association, and he'll present numbers 1 through 6 of the findings. Max?
Kerry, thank you very much. And maybe let me join Lennox in acknowledging and appreciating the families of many victims today represented by Colette, Gwen, and Philonis on your path, because your pain is our pain. It is our pain because your relatives' blood is our blood. They are the flesh of our flesh. Together, because of them, we are joined today in search of true humanity. And in this small act that we are committing today, we once again commit ourselves to the quest for the true justice that has been elusive in America for the longest time since slavery. I must say, therefore, that may the blood of the fallen continue to reverberate in us and help us never to cease our quest for justice and true humanity. May their souls rest in peace, and may they rise in eternal peace. The first finding that we have made, maybe let me start by indicating that we didn't just make these findings subjectively. We have dealt with an extensive analysis of the actual cases. We have listened to the expert testimonies, the testimonies of families, the testimonies of lawyers representing families, the medical legal reports and literature, the witness accounts, the reading of the professional bodies and their submissions, and augmented this with our own research and comparative experiences. The first finding from ourselves as the commissioner is we found that the pretextual traffic stops are a precursor to police killings. And use and the use of an excessive force against people of African descent. 6 of the 44 cases we heard involve police use of deadly force during traffic stops. This is absolutely not commensurate with the risk that the police face in these encounters. In our view, this is driven by stereotypes and racial bias. This is quite clear, the afterlife of slavery. In this instance, there is the perception that Black men are aggressive, whilst Black women are insane. It's in this instance that in many instances amongst the police and the law enforcement agencies, they equate Blackness with criminality. We've seen in the case of Sean Bell, who was killed a day before his wedding. We've seen in a case of Tavis Crane, whose daughter dropped a candy, stopped quickly by the police and ended up dead. We've seen the case of Mamadou Sisi, who was forced off the road and without any threat of violence was killed. The second finding from us is that the concept of broken window or order of maintenance triggers deadly violence against people of African descent. We have noted that this mode of policing relies very heavily on a racialized assumption about what constitutes disorder and what communities are disorderly. And in this way of saying the police authorities are dealing with small crimes, they end up deadly. That's the example of George Floyd, where the issue at the beginning was only the $20 bill. It's the same case as the Eric Garner case, where the issue at the beginning was just the selling of loose cigarettes. So we also found that race-based street stops or stops and frisk are another form of order maintenance policing that drives not only the racially biased arrest, but often triggers the use of deadly force by the police. The third finding is the police violation of the Fourth Amendment rights of Black people to be secure in their persons, to be secure in their housings, and for them not to be searched unreasonable or their properties unreasonable seized. These violations, including the securing of warrants that have no reasonable basis, but at the same time are disregarding the truth. On the other hand, these searches are based on reliance on discredited and sometimes unreliable informants. We find a proliferation of the use of risky, no-knock warrants. Police just enter houses of Black people without a valid warrant or justification. This invariable, like in other cases, lead to an excessive force and ultimately death. We have noted very terrible cases where a 7-year-old Albertina Sprayle was killed, a 12-year-old Tamil Rice, and other cases like Ramali Graham, an 18-year-old, who all of these people were executed to death without any form of a crime that they have committed. We've also found out that a third of cases presented to us related to lethal application of restraints, such as compression, asphyxia, and chokehold. We found that there is excessive use of tasers, chokeholds, rough rides through police van, and a terrible growing pattern of use of vehicles as a deadly weapon against people of African descent, especially targeting Black men in dirt bikes. all of these with fatal consequences. We also found that the lethal police violence against people of African descent is exacerbated by medical apartheid and police failure to provide medical attention. This has happened in circumstances where medical attention, if it was provided at all or timeously, many lives would have been saved. Our view, this is not only dehumanizing, but it demonstrates a complete disregard of Black lives. We also found on the sixth occasion that the lethal police violence against people of African descent experiencing mental health crisis is systematic. In all the cases we have heard in which a Black person was experiencing mental health crisis, police responded instead of trained medical professionals. And in every case, the police used gratuitous violence that led to the victim's death. In all of these cases, the resultant death, in our view, is absolutely needless and avoidable, and a clear indication of a systematic problem, not just a congruence of isolated events. So I will hand over to you, Bert and Kerry, to finish the remainder of our findings. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Max. And next is Commissioner Bert Samuels from Jamaica, partner and head of litigation with the firm Knight, Junior, and Samuels, and he's the deputy chairman of the Jamaican National Council on Reparation. Bert?
Thank you. I just want the listeners to know that the commissioners were often brought to tears when we saw what was happening in the United States of America. It was a painful exercise, and we're here to tell the world what is happening in the United States. The commission examined police use of force against transgender Black women and girls. We found that transgender women and girls are disproportionately killed. That is, 250 women were killed by police between 2015 and 2020. Black women constituted 48 of those 250 women, which is 20%, although they are only 13% of the population. Black women are stereotyped as aggressive and angry, increasing police tendency to use force against them. Nicola Robinson was a pregnant Black woman, kicked in the stomach and told, "You're lucky I did not kill your baby." Alberta Spirit and Breonna Taylor were women killed in their own homes with botched drug raids on their homes with no knock warrants. The commission also concluded that the systemic racist police violence kills and traumatizes Black children and youth. Tamil Rice incident is a case in point of the use of lethal force on a 12-year-old boy and the traumatization of his sister, Tajil. Contrast Tamir's shooting, that 12-year-old Black American boy, with a 17-year-old white Kyle Rittenhouse, who allegedly shot 2 protesters in 2020 and walked with his rifle past police who failed to stop or question him. Our conclusion is that the police don't see Black children as children. The awful case of police killing of Tamika Wilson, who died after being shot in her chest. The police bullet also severed the index finger of her 14-month-old infant who was in her arms. Casey Goodison, shot in his home, where he was entering after purchasing takeout food for his family. The house had 9 family members present when he was shot. The officer has suffered no consequence as a result of the shooting of Goodison. Jacob Blake was shot on his son's birthday and was injured in the arms, kidney, liver, and spinal cord, remaining paralyzed from waist down. We, the commissioners, found that racist police violence traumatizes and devastates families and communities. The commission found that when victims of police violence are killed, their families and communities remain devastated. For example, in the George Floyd case, not only was George's girlfriend and brother, as witnesses in court, driven to tears, but civilian witnesses from the community were visibly broken when they had to relive the trauma. Distrustful of the police, Black people refuse to call them when there's an emergency. Parents warn their sons to keep off the streets and cooperate fully with the police when encountered by them. African American men in particular are prisoners in their own communities. Many of us have refrained from watching those infamous filmed 9.5 minutes because we just cannot cope with the trauma. After Juan May was shot and no charges brought, his grandmother refused to eat and eventually died. Philanese Floyd, George's brother, was moved to say, and I quote, "Not only did my brother have the weight of 3 police officers on him, he had the weight of a nation plagued with centuries of systemic racism that stole his last breath." Black immigrants are particularly vulnerable to systemic racist police violence and police killings. The commission found that a professor of human rights, Bustillo, was right when he said, and I quote, "Immigration policy in the US has always been an expression of white supremacy and white nationalism. Draconian immigration laws compound the harm to Black immigrant victims of racist police violence. Botham Jean, a college graduate from St. Lucia in the Caribbean, where I live, was killed in his own apartment when an officer entered his apartment and shot him as he sat eating ice cream. We found that there are several obstacles in the path of justice for Black people. Firstly, acquittal rates are high as police are investigated by police themselves with the inherent conflict of interest. Grand jury complicit with prosecutors' bidding, refusing to indict officers who then get away with murder. Thirdly, officers are charged in only 1% of killings. Prosecutors have unlimited powers in deciding whether or not to prosecute. Prosecutors do not pursue the police as they do ordinary citizens. In fact, Tamil Rice's case, his parents were moved to conclude that the prosecutor was the police defense attorney. We now go to and looked at destruction of evidence. The commission found that there was collusion to cover up, manipulate, and obstruct justice. And there was open collusion between the police officers, police unions, prosecutors, coroners, and independent medical examiners. Police officers are allowed to consult with unions before giving statements and have an opportunity to manipulate the narrative in relation to executions they carry out. Officers are permitted to see the body camera images before family members can, inviting them to manipulate same. Medical examiners have given false causes of death in order to exonerate police officers. Notwithstanding the 9.5 minutes video shown onto the world, the medical examiner made no physical findings that George was suffering and was diagnosed with traumatic asphyxia or strangulation. This is why citizens' video footage are necessary, as was also demonstrated in the case of Manuel Ellis, where the police narrative of his killing was contradicted by a bystander's video. There's a lack of oversight of the police we found. The blue wall of silence is where fellow officers cover for each other. In Carrie Ann Horn's case, she was dismissed from the police force in 2006 because she tried to stop a fellow officer, a white police officer, from choking Neil Mack, who was handcuffed. The former Buffalo, New York police officer was finally compensated last year when her termination was overturned. We see as one of a huge problem is the use of qualified immunity. This problem prevents reparatory justice for families whose loved ones have been killed. Qualified immunity is the primary obstacle to securing civil remedies. It is a judicially created doctrine which shields government officials, mainly the police, from personal liability for constitutional violation. The Commission calls upon the Congress to abolish qualified immunity so that justice can come to those who have been wronged by state agents. This rule flies in the face of accountability and denies families compensation for their loss of loved ones, increasing the pain they endure from criminal acts by police officers. The Commission calls upon the government of the United States of America to look at our recommendations and to take immediate steps to correct the unabated epidemic of police killings of Black women and men by conducting an overhaul of the system of justice as it relates to the use of force by those employed to protect and serve. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. And so next I'm going to call on our rapporteur that's present, Professor Marjorie Cohn, who's going to share one of the commissioner's recommendations and findings.
On crimes against humanity and human rights violations, yes. The commissioners find that systemic racist police violence against people of African descent in the United States has resulted in a pattern of gross and reliably attested violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms. The commissioners find violations of the right to life, the right to liberty and security, the right to mental health, the right to be free from arbitrary detention, and the right to be free from torture and other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, including by the use of tasers, chokeholds, and compression asphyxia. The U.S. torture statute only punishes torture committed abroad. The commissioners find violations of the right to be free from discrimination based on race, gender, disability, or status as a child. The stop and frisk doctrine is an invitation for illegal racial profiling, and the Supreme Court allows pretextual stops for traffic violations even when the officer is motivated by racism in violation of international law. The commissioners find violations of the right to a fair trial and the presumption of innocence, which constitute extrajudicial killings, as well as the right to be treated with humanity and respect. The commissioners find violations of the United States' duty to provide medical care to detained persons, to ensure investigations of extrajudicial killings that are independent, competent, thorough, and effective, and to prosecute suspects and punish perpetrators to ensure that they are held accountable. Police officers in the United States enjoy impunity for their racist violence. They are rarely held accountable for killing Black people, and qualified immunity protects them against liability for violation of constitutional rights. The commissioners find that both U.S. laws and police practices, as documented in the 44 cases heard by the commissioners, and national data, do not comply with the international standards on the use of force. Police may only use force when strictly necessary, and it must be proportional to the seriousness of the harm it is meant to prevent. They may not use firearms except in self-defense or defense of others, and only against imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm. Lethal force cannot be used to protect law and order or to safeguard property. Yet police in the United States do this routinely. The force used must be lawful, strictly necessary, proportionate to both the threat and the legitimate objective, and directed towards respecting and preserving human life. But Supreme Court jurisprudence allows police officers to use deadly force if they have probable cause to believe the suspect committed a past crime. No state laws require that lethal force can only be used as a last resort when necessary to prevent imminent death or serious injury. The commissioners find that the systemic racism and police violence against people of African descent in the United States constitute crimes against humanity. These crimes, under the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court, include the crime against humanity of murder, the crime against humanity of severe deprivation of physical liberty, the crime against humanity of persecution of people of African descent, and the crime against humanity of inhumane acts causing great suffering or serious injury to body or mental or physical health. All of these crimes against humanity occurred in the context of a widespread or systematic attack directed against the civilian population of Black people in the United States, as demonstrated by the findings of fact in this report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marjorie. We're going to move into the recommendations now, and I'd actually like you to begin, Marjorie, by giving the ICC recommendations.
Yes, the commissioners call on the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, upon receipt of this report of the Commission of Inquiry, to initiate an investigation into crimes against humanity committed and condoned by officials in the United States. The prosecutor may initiate investigations on the basis of information on crimes within the jurisdiction of the court. He or she may seek additional information from states, organs of the United Nations, intergovernmental or non-governmental organizations, or other reliable sources. If the prosecutor concludes that there is a reasonable basis to proceed with an investigation of crimes against humanity, he or she shall submit to the pretrial chamber of the International Criminal Court a request for authorization of an investigation. The United States has not ratified the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. The commissioners call on the executive branch of the United States to sign and ratify the Rome Statute. In the meantime, the U.S. can submit to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court for purposes of an investigation into these crimes against humanity against people of African descent in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, and so continuing with recommendations, I'm going to call on Commissioner Hina Jalani of Pakistan. Commissioner Jalani is a member of the Elders, an independent group of global leaders founded by Nelson Mandela in 2007, who work together for peace, justice, and human rights. Commissioner Jalani is also the president of the World Organization Against Torture and co-chair of the World Refugee Council.
Thank you very much. Let me first of all thank the steering committee for undertaking this project, and thank you for involving all the commissioners in taking this project forward. I also must say to the commissioners that it was very much a privilege to have worked with you. To the families of the victims who spoke to us, I thank you for sharing your experiences with us and giving us information that has made it possible for us to write this report. All my sympathies and solidarity with the families. While looking at the violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms in comparison and in compliance with the international human rights law and standards governing the use of force, the Commission noted the critical role that the United States has played in drafting and adopting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and has also noted that the United States has ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment of Punishment, and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination. These are three of the most important human rights treaties that protect the human rights and fundamental freedoms of Black people in the United States in the context of policing. The provisions of treaties the US has ratified are part of the US law and are binding on all US states under the Supremacy Clause of the US Constitution. The protection of the rights enshrined in these treaties as applied to law enforcement officers are primarily codified in the Code of Conduct for Law Enforcement Officials and the United Nations Basic Principles on the Use of Force and Firearms by Law Enforcement Officials. Both the Code of Conduct and the Basic Principles are built around protection internationally recognized human rights, such as the right to human dignity, the right to life, prohibition against torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, the right to mental health, and the right to equality and non-discrimination. The Commission has found that the US laws and police practices do not comply with the international standards on the use of force, and this non-compliance has resulted in serious and repeated violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms of the African American population. The facts of the 44 cases examined by the Commission of African American people who were killed or maimed by the police revealed the structural racism embedded in the US legal and policing systems. The Commission has concluded that US law and practices regarding police use of force do not fulfill the international requirement of legality. These arbitrary killings were unjust, unpredictable, done without due process of law, and in violation of the requirements of legality, necessity, and proportionality as required by the UN Basic Principles on the Use of Force. It is also amply clear that the United States has failed in its duty to investigate and ensure effective remedies when violations have occurred. Many of the serious violations recorded by the Commission resulted from the failure of law enforcement officers to fulfill their duties under the Code of Conduct, such as denial of and failure to secure medical attention for people in their custody, and in some cases, actively preventing medical treatment from being administered. Based on these conclusions, the International Commission has recommended and called upon the United Nations Human Rights Council to constitute an independent commission of inquiry mandated to conduct full investigation into incidents of police violence against people of African descent in the United States, and to determine in particular whether the level of violence constitutes gross violation of human rights and whether crimes under international criminal law have been and continue to be committed. In order to establish a continuous process to monitor systemic racist police violence in the United States, we have recommended the appointment by the United Nations Human Rights Council of an independent expert on systemic racist police violence in the United States. We have also recommended to the executive branch of the United States government to sign the Rome Statute of the ICC and transmit it to the US Senate for consent for ratification. We have also asked for the issuance of an annual report to be produced by the US Department of Justice to be presented to the House Judiciary Committee and to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment on the implementation of strategies adopted to end the criminal legal system harms that continue to violate the human rights of Black and Brown communities, the LGBTQIA people, Indigenous peoples, mentally ill individuals, and disabled people. We have also asked for outlawing use of force except in conformity with the UN basic principles and the UN guidance on less lethal weapons in law enforcement, strictly in accordance with the mandated principles of legality, precaution, necessity, proportionality, and accountability. And in this regard, to develop policies and support for legislation to demilitarize policing throughout the United States and accomplish a complete overhaul of current policies and training practices to ensure compliance with international law and standards. The US government should immediately ratify the core international human rights treaties and regional human rights instruments, to which the United States is still not a party, and should remove reservations related to the treaties that it has signed or ratified, including those stating that these treaties are non-self-executing. The US should fully implement, monitor, and enforce its obligations emanating from the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination and the Convention Against Torture, which the US has already ratified. The Commission has taken note of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights 2018 report, Police Violence Against Afro-Descendants in the United States, and has called upon the Commission to continue to actively support the cry for justice of the people of African descent in the United States. The Commission has also called upon the international community, as well as the special procedures and independent experts holding human rights mandates, to continue to raise their voices at all international and regional forums in order to keep the concerns expressed in our report a center of focus and of action, especially in the United Nations Human Rights Council. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, and we're going to move to Commissioner Dr. Arturo Fournier from Costa Rica, the former ambassador to the Russian Federation.
Thank you. I wish to send my deepest sympathy to the families of the victims as well. We respectfully make some recommendations to the executive branch of the US government, presided by Mr. Biden's administration. We think that to achieve these results, in the struggle for justice, it has to be started at the higher administrative level. Then we will try to summarize in a few minutes the long list stated in pages 130 through 136 of the report. So we deem appropriate to point out some institutional measures, such as support the BREATHE Act, specifically those provisions aimed at divesting federal resources from incarceration and policing, and ending the criminal legal system harms that have disproportionately criminalized Black and Brown communities, LGBTQIA people, Indigenous people, mentally ill individuals, and disabled people, and instead invest in a new non-punitive and non-carceral approaches to community safely utilizing funding incentives. Respect and accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, as has been stated. In relation to the United States, under Article 12, with respect to any and all crimes against humanity as defined in the Rome Statute. Sign the Rome Statute of the ICC and transmit to the US Senate for consent of ratification. Legal and policy measures. Develop policies and support for legislation in line with the George Floyd Justice in Policing Bill in relation to hiring and retaining law enforcement officers that would create a national registry of incidents of use of force, including all incidents of lethal and less than lethal means, and included racial statistics of victims and perpetrators. Addressing use of force practices, develop policies and support for legislation to demilitarize policing throughout the United States and accomplish a complete overhaul of current policies and training practices, including but not limited to the following. For example, outlaw chokeholds or other tactics for subduing that cut off breathing and blood circulation. Further recommendations to the executive branch of the United States government. Develop policies and support legislation to hold law enforcement officials accountable for their wrongful and illegal actions. Also, we are submitting some recommendations to the US Congress as pass the BREATHE Act, including those provisions which end such programs as the Department of Defense 1033 program and other programs aimed at divesting federal resources from incarceration and policing and ending the criminal legal system harms, and instead investing in the new approaches to community safety utilizing funding incentives. Finally, recommendations to state and local governments of the United States to the extent the federal government does not have jurisdiction or there are constitutional restraints to regulate the 18,000 local law enforcement forces in the United States. And last but not least, or least but not last, for example, we recommend that the US government executive and legislative branches should acknowledge that the transatlantic trade in Africans, enslavement, colonization and colonialism and neocolonialism constitute a crime against humanity and are among the major sources and manifestations of racism, racial discrimination, Afrophobia, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Past injustices and crimes against people of African descent must be addressed with reparatory justice. And I add, from my personal point of view, such as it has been done in South America in favor of many victims of the military dictatorships during the past century. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arturo. Okay, and finally, our final presentation will be Commissioner Sir Claire K. Roberts, former Attorney General of Antigua and Barbuda, former Solicitor General of Antigua and Barbuda, former Senator of Antigua and Barbuda, former High Court Judge, and former President of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Sir Claire?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It is hoped that placing international spotlight on systemic racist police violence against people of African descent in the United States will contribute to its eradication. I present the recommendations addressed to the Human Rights Council and the Office of the High Commissioner. The International Commission of Inquiry on Systemic Racist Police Violence against People of African Descent in the United States draws the attention of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights to the findings and recommendations in its report, and urges the High Commissioner to support the following in her report mandated by the Human Rights Council in its Resolution 43. A, constitution by the UN Human Rights Council of an independent commission of inquiry mandated to conduct full investigation into incidents of police violence against people of African descent in the United States, and to determine, in particular, whether the level of violence constitutes gross violation of human rights and whether crimes under international criminal law have been and continue to be committed. B, in order to establish a continuous process to monitor systemic racist police violence in the United States, the appointment by the UNHRC of an independent expert on systemic racist police violence in the United States. C, call for the demilitarization of law enforcement throughout the United States. And D, call for the end to impunity and for accountability of the police officials resorting to racist violence and unjustified force before independent civilian review boards and in criminal and civil proceedings of the justice system in the United States. We now look at recommendations to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. The Commission of Inquiry takes note of the important work already undertaken by the IACHR, notably in its November 26, 2018 report, Police Violence Against Afro-Descendants in the United States, and in its August 2020 call on the United States to implement structural reforms in the institutional systems of security and justice to counter historical racial discrimination and institutional racism. The Commission of Inquiry respectfully requests the IACHR to incorporate the Commission's findings and recommendations into the IACHR's ongoing monitoring and fact-finding, and to continue to press for and articulate the urgent need for such structural reforms. The Commission of Inquiry respectfully urges the IACHR to continue to actively support the cry for justice of people of African descent in the United States, who have a similar early history of enslavement and discrimination as the people of African descent of the Caribbean and Central and South America. And lastly, I present the recommendations to the member states of the African Union. The Commission of Inquiry takes note of the powerful concerns expressed by the chairperson of the African Union, the Honorable Musa Faki Mahamat, the Honorable Kwesi Kwate, Deputy Chairperson of the African Union Commission, the African Group of Members of the UN Human Rights Council, and participants in the HRC's urgent debate following the murder of George Floyd. Several speakers in that debate endorsed the idea of creating an independent commission of inquiry and urged the HRC to take action and not become a passive observer. Several people urged the United States to take action to resolve the structural issues and economic inequality that led to the recent events. We heard the call for an independent commission of inquiry, and we have acted upon it. We respectfully urge the African Union the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, the UN Special Rapporteur on Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and related forms of intolerance, and all related special procedures mandate holders to pay the closest attention to the voices of people of African descent in the United States, including victims, survivors, jurists, and academics, whose evidence of gross and well-attested patterns of human rights violations we have documented and put before you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sir Claire. That was an excellent way to close the presentations. So I'm going to open it up if any members of the press have questions, but I do want to acknowledge 3 of our commissioners who are here, but who didn't make presentations today. First, there's Mr. Hannibal Owaifo from Nigeria, President of the African Bar Association, Commissioner Judge Peter Herbert from the United Kingdom, Chair of the Society of Black Lawyers, and Commissioner Marie Fanon Mendes France from France, President of the France Fanon Foundation and former Chair of the UN Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. Thank you for being here. All right, so for the press, if there are any questions, you can type a question into the chat or raise your hand. All right. Okay. Let's see. All right, you may speak.
Yes, this is Brother Naba Muhammad, Editor-in-Chief of the Final Call newspaper. We've been covering this issue over the last 40 years. During your presentation, there were several items mentioned related to action at the executive level. Can you give me briefly, if you would, perhaps the top 3 or 4 items that were mentioned, and talk a little bit about why those items are important and how easily it would be for President Biden to actually do those things that you're requesting?
Okay, so I believe Hina and Arturo, you presented on recommendations to the executive. So if you want to answer about, which ones you think were particularly key, you can go ahead. Would you like to respond to that?
Well, as police depends on administrative officers, it is important for them to receive instructions and directions from the highest level in order to try to stop some of the practices we have stated here.
Okay, Hina, would you like to add to that?
I think it's very important to remember that President Biden has already said that after the George Floyd judgment, that this is a moment of transformation. I do hope that the recommendations that this report makes will guide him in making that transformation a reality.
Okay, thank you both. And do any of the other panelists want to respond? No? Okay, thank you, Mr. Mohammed. All right, are there any other questions from the press? You can raise your hand or type it in the chat. Okay, I see that Mimi Rosenberg from WBAI, she says that she's going to follow up with us after the press conference. Thank you, Mimi. Thank you for being here. All right. Well, I think it looks like there aren't any other, okay, we've got, okay. All right, Andrew Craig, you can go ahead. You can unmute.
Unmute here. Hello, and thank you for having this. I have to ask a kind of blunt question. We have a very lengthy and thorough report, a lot of passion, and a distinguished group of creators of the report. But I don't see much discussion of the political, I'll call them realities or obstacles and pathways to success, other than just pressuring for unilateral action at either the ICC or the Biden administration. Specifically, and I'll come to a question, but there seems to be very little recognition that the United States just underwent an attempted fascist coup to overthrow the elections. The International Commission on Human Rights, and I know that's not the main focus here, but it's an opaque entity, much like the ICC, and it's just hard to see how you get from a country that's undertaking these police brutality and outrageous situations and a fascist attempted overthrow of the government to get to any meaningful action. I mean, what's the constituency in around the world and in the United Nations to challenge the US when it's not even a member of the ICC?
Thank you very much for that question. Lennox, would you like to make a response?
Yes. We have several choices. You are correct, given the political situation in the United States. We can stand on the sidelines and wring our hands. We can decide to do nothing and say it is helpless. Or we can do what we are doing here, which is to mobilize the international community, to hold the United States to account before the international community. And we can provide an objective statement of the reality that experts have shown in terms of the hypocrisy of the United States government, holding itself up to be the bastion of human rights, while the objective evidence states to the contrary. Now, the United States is a member of the United Nations. The United States does not want to be condemned before the United Nations or before the international community. And that is attested to by the fact that once the people in the United States petitioned the United Nations to have an independent inquiry, what was the position of the United States? The United States then pressured every country and threatened
Okay. It looks like Lennox is frozen. So in the meantime, I know that Commissioner Peter Herbert wanted to respond to the question as well. So Peter, maybe you can share your thoughts while we're waiting for Lennox.
Yes, very briefly, just to endorse what Lennox has said. I mean, we're all optimists that we can guarantee change. And as Lennox said, change in a sense, never came without a struggle, as Frederick Douglass echoed many years ago. So the answer to the speaker is a political one. We're fully aware of the political restraints on the Biden administration and the realpolitik, but you have to remember here that I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. When the video of the murder of George Floyd went across the world, there were demonstrations in every single capital that has not been since the Vietnam War. And therefore, you cannot underestimate the power of people across the world, not just people of African descent, but Hispanic, progressive white people, young people all across the globe did immense damage to the United States' reputation. Now, you had a previous administration who couldn't care less, it seemed, but the Biden administration clearly does. You cannot have a United States which, as Lennox says, seeks to lecture China about the persecution of Uyghur people, or the Myanmar government about the atrocities committed against the Rohingya, and yet sit idly by and have the murder of African American and Hispanic people as a matter of modern day lynching. So for me, it is about we utilize all the vast tools at our resource across the world. And America is a consumer society. You know, the bus boycotts of the 1950s drove the civil rights agenda because white businesses and white society could not sustain themselves without the economic impetus of the African American community. And so we as a global market, there is such a thing as sanctions. Part of what brought down the apartheid regime, and only part, was the decision by millions of people across the world to boycott South African goods. American goods are not unique. They can be boycotted. They can be far more radical solutions. So we're fully aware that the United States lives in a global village, and it has learned it's to its cost in terms of COVID, but also in terms of police violence. And the demonstrators, just closing, the demonstrators that took to the streets in Nigeria over SARS, the demonstrations that we took part in outside the US Embassy in Nairobi, and the demonstrations that were taking place on the streets of London from Paris to Brazil are a reminder that the United States is not above the law. And therefore, I think the message is one of optimism. Pressure can be brought to bear. And at the end of the day, if the Democratic Party does not deliver, then in a sense, African Americans hold the key power to who determines who sits in the US Senate and Congress. So the time is right and the time is now for this change. And obviously condolences to all the families. And I certainly speak from the heart in saying that we were all deeply moved by the suffering that we saw and heard. And my admiration for the courage and steadfastness of all those individuals and families who gave evidence so bravely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Lennox, I don't know if you'd like to continue.
No, what happened, my internet connection was disrupted. And I'm not buying into a conspiracy theory that it was done maliciously. But I listened to the last part of Peter's comments, and I endorse it entirely. And I think that our objective at this point is to hold the United States accountable in terms of the international community. And some of the strategies and tactics discussed by Peter, obviously, is on the table. But this is the first step in rolling out the recommendations so that the press would understand the comprehensiveness of the recommendations and findings that we have made. And as we move on, we will be putting pressure both on the Biden administration and on the Congress of the United States to listen to the voices of the victims of police crimes as reflected in the recommendations.
Thank you, Lennox. Arturo, did you also want to contribute?
Yes, thank you. We live in an internationalized world each day more. And so we must think as jurists, what do we aim for to achieve and be part of the international system of human rights and uniform all the laws, covenants, treaties about that. Also, for not going too much away from our continent, we have in the American continent an international Inter-American Court on Human Rights, and there we can submit many cases of violations of human rights. Therefore, it is very important that one of the important countries of America, the United States, will become part and abide by all the regulations and norms in human rights in this continent.
Excellent point. Thank you, Arturo. I want to move to Phyllis Thompson. Phyllis, can you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, so I wanted to know with these findings, what can we do? Well, first of all, what can y'all do to help us? And what can we do to like protect us and our families? And maybe so this won't happen to anyone else.
Who would like to respond to that?
Yeah, if I could.
Yes, please, Bert.
I think the idea of commissioners being outside of the United States has made this very difficult for the US to hide from the recommendations because we're looking in. In our respective countries, the US does come in to see and talk about, extrajudicial killings in Jamaica and that we need to do better than we're doing. So we're used to the United States looking at our countries, respective countries. Now that we're looking into the US, we are hoping that as outsiders making these recommendations, that we'll be seen to be objective and that help will come to United States. We're hoping that the current United States regime will listen to us. We know that a year ago we would not have been listened to. We're hoping that since there's an administration change, there will be a change, and the US will look at itself and take the recommendations of outsiders who we have persons living in the United States who are related to us in the Caribbean. The Caribbean community in the United States is a huge community, and some of our nationals have been the victims of what has happened. So that we're saying that this is a village, a global village, and we're hoping that the misconduct of the US will be enlarged and magnified, and that there will be some healing and some self-introspection so that we will move forward.
Thank you, Bert. Thank you. Okay, I think, Mr. Muhammad, did you have another question? If so, can you unmute yourself?
I'm sorry, thank you. There was a previous question about domestic US politics and the impact of those politics on the recommendations and the findings. But America, of course, holds an outsized influence at the United Nations, both in the amount of money that it gives, as well as its ability to pressure countries to bow to its interests. Is there a way, or how can work be done to blunt that American influence and power to keep this country from being held accountable to standards that it often imposes on other countries around the world?
May I, Carrie,
yes,
make a comment? Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I think that the comment about the United States outsized role at the United Nations is accurate. However, we have to utilize certain contradictions that exist.
We know, for example, that Kenya is now going to, has assumed the presidency of the Security Council. We are planning to unfold a strategy to mobilize the member states of the African Union, and we are going to mobilize within the continent of Africa, including in Kenya, to bring pressure upon the African Union so that they in turn would be able to put pressure on the Security Council and also on the Human Rights Council. This is not going to be an easy a task, but we believe that based upon the findings, the concrete findings of fact, that bolstered by the expertise and the reputation and the impartiality of our 12 international experts, that we will be able to garner the type of support from the international community. Bear in mind that the United States fought tooth and nail not to have an international commission, and instead argued that the problem is a global problem, so as to deflect any particular focus on the United States. Notwithstanding that, we have this particular commission with its findings with a spotlight on the United States, and we are going to mobilize the international community. We hope the press who are here today will utilize the power of the press to highlight the recommendations and to publicize these recommendations. This is the role that you as the media can play in bringing pressure on the administrative arm of the United States government.
Thank you, Lennox. Okay, two of our commissioners have their hands raised. First, Commissioner Uefo. Please unmute.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I want to thank all the commissioners, particularly those who made presentations today, for the excellent way in which our findings were all captured. And then too, I want to commiserate with the families of all those concerned. It's been a harrowing experience. I was shocked beyond the bone to see some of the atrocities that have been committed and that were unredressed and remains unredressed. Answer one of the journalist questions, quite frankly, from my perspective and from the perspective of the Human Rights Committee of the African Bar. We just finished a meeting yesterday, a 3-day meeting yesterday, and it doesn't seem to us that the atrocities being committed in reference to the question asked by journalists is going to stop anytime soon. Because why the George Floyd issue, as bad as it was and as heinous and criminal as it was, what's going on and being debated, more of those crimes were being committed across the United States. So it's not something we're going to look at as a one-off thing or something. It's going to be a long-drawn campaign to bring the United States to its senses, and all cards must be on the table. The African Bar, fortunately, we are taking the decision of the Human Rights Committee to the Governing Council that will hold its meeting next week or thereabouts in Monrovia. And no, not next week, I think on the 12th of May, from what I was hearing from the chairman now. And it's going to be a subject of discussion because the conference sessions are already planning to hold an entire session spanning a day or two on this panel of inquiry in the next African Bar Conference, which is coming up in October in Niamey, Niger Republic. We will do all our best to invite all our commissioners, as many as can come, and the different associations and societies to come to join us, because the direction which the African Bar is facing is pressuring the sub-general groups and the African Union, taking the fight directly to these commissions so they can stand up to the global stage and bring up this issue at every global event in order to begin to make the United States understand that it's not, like someone rightly said, above the law. It's subject, the United States is subject to international law, just like other people, even though it's not a signatory to the ICC, the Rome Statute. It doesn't mean that the crimes committed in the United States will remain unpunished forever. It must be understood in the context of what has happened across the world, that those who committed these crimes and those who aided and abetted them, particularly those who are in government who refuse to act, even at their old age, are able to be called to account for those crimes. So I believe that the systematic pressure started by this committee should be continued while we take on the Mas Pokwana is there. He's from South Africa, doing a great job. Heard so much about him. We in the African continent must see this as our fight, as an our battle. And the African Bar Association is ready and willing and able as much as possible to convince many other bar associations to hold their governments into this fight. And then, of course, for we, after the governing council, it's going to be part of the full conference discussion. And then, of course, we'll visit the different commissions and appear in different events and continue to make it a daily and topical media event, media issue for the prayers to go. So I want to say that we are starting a long race and we must all be prepared to be on this race till it is won. And it's a battle that can be won. I do not think the Biden administration is going to key into it as quickly as some may believe. But I think that we can make some significant impact during this administration. Having said that, once again, I thank all the commissioners, particularly the steering committee. I think it's a very beautiful job, and I'm proud to have been part of this inquiry. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hannibal. And as you say, it's a long race, but it can be won. That's very true. Hina, I believe you wanted to speak.
Yes, I just wanted to respond to an earlier comment that was made, that there is a lot of passion in this report. You know, there is not just passion, there is passion, but there is also a very deep and objective analysis of facts and the law on which we have based our conclusions. We were also not unaware when we were making these recommendations of the challenges that will come in the way of implementation when we come to the real politics or political or even social challenges that come in our way. But that has never stopped human rights defenders, especially people like me, to chart out a course for change. And as Desmond Tutu once said, we are all prisoners of hope. But here we are not just prisoners of hope, but we are also soldiers of hope for going forward. And I'm sure that there are many like us. Also, do not forget that the international community is not just states. The international community includes a very large international civil society that is already paying heed to what this report is saying. And their pressure cannot be underestimated, both at the international forums and within their own states, to change the hesitation into resolve in order to make sure that action is taken at the appropriate stages.
Thank you so much. Excellent response. So I wanted to let you know that another commissioner of ours, Rashida Manju of South Africa, is here. She's joined. And I'm just moving her over to be a panelist. I hope it worked. Let's see. And she wanted to make a contribution. Rashida?
Hi, I'm not going to put my camera on, partly because my bandwidth is not great. But thank you very much to all the commissioners who participated, the steering committee, the rapporteurs, etc. and my deep condolences, but also we owe a debt of gratitude to the families, the lawyers who participated in enabling us to come up with a report with these recommendations. The question around the value and the way forward raised for me what is currently going on in South Africa. Mr. Mayeni, a South African citizen who moved to Hawaii, married an American woman, was killed by the police, I think a week or 10 days ago. And there have been protests in South Africa outside US consulates and embassies around this killing. But it isn't just about taking on the Americans. It's also been about taking on our own government to ask questions. What are you going to do? This is a citizen of this country who's, currently residing in Hawaii, killed by the police, and the circumstances are questionable on different levels. The local media has been carrying interviews with his widow. They have 2 young children. And so we do live in a global village. And it's not just a report on its own is given life by the voices, by the agency, by the visibility. And I think this report will do that. As someone who served in the UN Special Procedures Mechanisms, the other value that I see is that our reports never die. Even 7, 8 years down the line, I will get an email telling me about some recommendation that I made to the US government on the investigation that I had carried out and the report that was produced. So the reports have a life of their own and a value that we should never underestimate, whether it's by human rights defenders, whether it's by activists on the ground, whether it's governments, UN agencies, people within human rights, people within the UN system. And this is where I see this is a starting point. The report will take on a life of its own. And I am pleased that I've been part of this process. So thank you very much for giving me that opportunity. Thank you.
Rashida, thank you so much for being here. I know that you had a lot of things going on right now. And I want to mention that Rashida is the former UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. Okay, so we have been going for quite a while with lots of excellent comments. Are there any other questions from the press or comments from anyone else?
Kerry, can I make a last comment?
Sure, please.
No, thank you very much. And I think the questions and the responses have been quite useful. And I like the ground that was covered by Peter. But Lennox will recall the importance of the fact that America takes itself quite serious, and it takes its image quite serious, but it also takes its business quite serious. I think this gives us an opportunity to take this report beyond ourselves as jurists, but also to take it into the business platforms to make sure that it is being endorsed at that level. Because in South Africa, when we were raising all of these human rights issues, it was when we said nobody must buy South African oranges that South Africa began to take the struggle and the solidarity quite serious. I think it's critical that the report is not confined to lawyers. We need to take this report to be endorsed by business, and they must also be a voice that adds to the calls that we are making. It's a report that we must also take to the Friends of America and in their engagement to make sure that they raise these issues. And it must, as it has already been said, that it be taken to all the multilateral forums, including the organized legal profession around the world, so that they can adopt it. And I think this is a type of a report that should not be allowed to be filed anywhere. It must continue to be a living report. It must continue to be a tool that we are using as a pressure to achieve this form of justice that we're talking about. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Max. Thank you. I like what you said, that it should be a living report that continues to be utilized. I concur. All right. I think that at this point, I'm going to close the press conference. It was excellent. Thank you to all of the press that attended. Thank you to the commissioners, our rapporteur, Lennox, and all who participated. And it's not over. The work continues. We're going to be mobilizing it, mobilizing the rollout of this report, as Lennox mentioned. And so there's still work to be done over the next few months. So I believe that the press, you have our contacts, and so you can follow up with us if you need to do any interviews or have any other questions. Thank you all, and have a good day.